County RCD, and she's been working on the Weaverville Community Forest for quite some time. And secondly, we have Todd Sloat from Fall River RCD, and he has worked on the Burney-Hat Creek Community Forest. So let's just listen and learn what is a community forest, and we can learn something from it, and maybe even apply it here sometime.
Great.
So without further ado.
Thank you, Kara. I'm actually on the board of directors for the Trinity County RCD, so I'm not an employee. And when this project first started, I wasn't even on the board of directors. So this predates that. I got involved in the community forest in 1999 because I actually lived right across the canyon from the big swath of BLM land that was now on the auction block to be traded out to a big timber company. And I was very concerned about what that big timber company would do, as were other people in the area. So I had recently retired from the county planning department, so I was pretty familiar with processes and agencies and environmental documents and all that kind of language and knowledge that a lot of people aren't. So I decided I was going to do whatever I could to delay or deflect or deny BLM the ability to trade this land out. And thus began the odyssey of the Weaverville Community Forest, little did I know. So this is just an example of a project. You got to sign up. And lo and behold, it went up probably 6 or 7 years ago, and it doesn't have one bullet in it. I marked that as a community invested in that forest. Okay, and by the way, this is my first PowerPoint stuff. I'm like excited and a little nervous. Okay, good. So this was, these were the things that we eventually developed as goals or as sort of a framework for thinking about a community forest, although I will say at the time when we started, we were really just trying to convince BLM that they should hold on to it, take it out of their planning document for trade, and just leave it the way it was. You know, they had lightly treated it a few times. It had some trespass issues. There was a road going through it that accessed other homes over another ridge. But you know, just why don't you just leave it there? It's nice, and we don't want SBI to rip it all out. So it kind of started like that, and I did what I knew I needed to do, which was I went to an advisory committee that advised the Board of Supervisors, which is the only governing body we have in Trinity County, and convinced them that they should support being against the trade. So it started out as sort of against. And then they went to the board and said, yeah, we think this is, you know, that this land shouldn't be traded out, so we'd like the board to make a stand and tell BLM, would you please not do that, which they did eventually. So we got a little time because BLM had recently, in the same year, 1999, earlier in the summer, tried to do a controlled burn of star thistle near a town called Liston, and they burned up half the town. So they were feeling kind of puny and in a corner, and we took advantage of that and pressed the bodies that could press them, and they said, okay, you know, it's in our plan of work. We need to trade this, but okay, maybe we'll hold off for a while. So as we bought the time, which was very critical in this stage of this, sorry, so we had time, and out of that came, you know, conversations about, well, because I knew you can't just say no, don't do this. You have to offer an alternative. You have to offer something different, because otherwise it doesn't give the politicians any kind of cover, and it certainly doesn't give the land managers any kind of options. So we started developing kind of a vision with the idea that we would actually try and buy it or acquire it somehow, because now the idea of the community forest was taking hold. We had an example over in Arcata. There were a couple other examples sort of in the region, and we thought, why couldn't we do that with federal land? Here's this 1,000 acres that is sort of next to town and sort of an island of federal land, and all the reason they want to get rid of it, which is, you know, it's close to town, there's trespass issues, there's this road, it needs to be treated, blah, blah, blah. We said, hey, we agree, let's keep it and manage it. So thus the idea of actually having a community forest was born. Okay, And so, did my other due diligence, took the editor of the paper out one Saturday, drove him around, showed him the land, said, hey, wouldn't this be great? He wrote an editorial, he had someone at the Reading Searchlight, wrote a story about it, started to get a little traction. And that was good. That was good for us. Because the land manager in BLM, in Reading at the time, was on his way out he was going to retire. And there were a few things he wanted to get done before he retired, and one of them was this land trade. So we were really trying to outlast him so that maybe we could get somebody different and then get a different result.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so just so I understand, so what's in it for so the land is federal,
Yes.
and so they were proposing to sell it to a timberland.
They were going to trade it because part of BLM's plan in Trinity County, especially the northern part of the county, is to acquire as many properties along the Trinity River as they can because they have this big recreation plan for the river, which they implemented many parts of. They had their eye on a piece of timberland up in near Lewiston, the SBI owned, they wanted to get.
SPI is the timber company.
Sierra Pacific Industries, the biggest private.
So they were going to trade it. Okay.
Yeah, and so they were going to trade. The other thing that happened around this time, too, that was advantageous to us in pure luck, was that the whole federal exchange program and policies was coming under some intense scrutiny because of some deals going down in Utah and around Las Vegas and down the desert. So the whole exchange program started to slow down anyway because they were getting challenged a lot more. Another thing in our favor. Okay, so this is so ironic. We decided, by now I'm on the board of directors for the RCD. I got on, this is 2004. I got on about a year and a half before. I'd actually gone there and made a presentation. I went to all the service organizations and made presentations about the community forest. I drummed up as much interest as I could. And so we decided to have a community meeting about this forestry idea on Friday, May 24th, 2004, Memorial Day weekend. And we got this many people to come out. Of course, we advertised that there would be food, and that always helps. And there's a couple of guys there that are from BLM. This guy, Charlie, I think he's still with them. He's the real estate guy. And there was one other person, there he is, Francis Berg. He's since retired. And they were sent up from the Reading office to kind of keep an eye on things. So by then, the old manager had retired, and a new manager had come on. And we dogged him too. We went to his little ceremony when he was, whatever. And we just wrote him letters and went down and met him, drove down to Sacramento and talked to the state guy. I mean, you do all that footwork, you just plant all those seeds, and some of them come up. So we had this community meeting. It was professionally facilitated. Huge advantage, highly recommend that. And out of it came some, a vision and some supporting language about what the community wanted to see in the community forest. And I have to say, the beginning, when we were first talking about it in the early 2000s, most people just wanted, whoever was going to manage it, they just leave it alone. Don't do anything to it. There's enough timber harvesting going on. And then we had a fire in 2001 that almost burned down Weaverville. And then people went, oh, fuels reduction, fire resiliency, forest management, okay. And then they, no pun intended, warmed up to the idea of actually managing a community forest. So in this meeting, a lot of that was talked about and integrated into the vision. So those were the priorities that came out of there. And I would have to say that all of those continue to be valid and true for the community forest. Although I would add that we also almost every year provide a firewood sale program for the public because we generate a lot of firewood from the activities from forest management. And so they come out in the fall, and it's all cut and split, everything. You just have to load it up and buy it and load it up. And that is a great way for people to literally get into the forest and then look at the signs signs that are posted and learn about this place that's literally next door to them. The other thing that's really important that connects people to it are the trails. We have a wonderful trail system in the Weaverville Basin, and it goes throughout the community forest. And that's, that is a way people connect to that environment. And I would include in there, and you don't really see it, but, forest management, active forest management. This is an example of getting the community involved. There is, on this one side of where the BLM piece is, there's really only one little subdivision on that side of the creek. But those people are intensely interested in what goes on around them because they kind of sit in a place that could go up in smoke literally if the right thing happened at the right time. So a lot of those folks came out, and the forester was out on site. The guy in the foreground is Walter Herzog. He's the forester for BLM out of Reading. And our local forester just said, come on out, I'm going to show you which trees I tied a ribbon around and which ones I didn't. What do you think? You think this tree should stay or not? This is why I chose this. And explained his process and kind of educated them a little bit about forestry. And people appreciated that, and they understood, and they became more tolerant about the decisions that were being made. Okay, finally the map. This is most of the community forest on BLM. There's little pieces here, but that's the main part. I literally live right there. So this was a case of a NIMBY, I think, working out really well. It's purely selfish on my part, but ended up being a community benefit, and I think very small good for that. So that was it. You can see the heart of Weaverville is where the two highways come together, and it literally is the backdrop for that part of town. You see it from almost every part of town. So it's a really important viewshed, and that became a really important component of the vision because so much of the basin has burned over time, and there's some ugly scars out there. And to have this intact and this field of green is remarkable and important. So what happened in 2004 was we had our community meeting. People got all excited and came up with all these different drawings and visions, and I still have those. They're very interesting. Well, the new manager, Steve Anderson, called me up about a month later and said, well, look, we're not going to sell you this, but there's this thing called stewardship contracting, and I think we can make this work as a community forest if we do it that way. And I'm like, heck yeah, I don't want to own this. I don't want to have all those issues. I mean, if you want to keep it and manage it as a community forest in partnership with the RCD, great, because we already had a long-standing relationship with BLM on other agreements in other parts of the county. We have, the RCD has very good partnerships with the feds and the state. So that foundation was already there. So about a year later, we signed the contract. It takes a while, but it took a while, but we signed it about a year later for a 10-year stewardship contract. I can't remember if what we have with BLM is an agreement or a contract, but it's worked out really well.
BLM still owns the land?
They still manage, yep.
And then you manage it as
Yes.
RCD?
Yes, yeah, and they really are hands off. It's a very different experience with them than it is Forest Service.
Now, are you held by the same regulations, et cetera, as anyone else in the state of California who does any harvesting?
Federal NEPA. If it was private, it would be CEQA and it would be the Board of Forestry.
So you're not held by any of the state of California?
No. So you can see what was important with stewardship contracting. Under stewardship contracting, you identify tasks or programs or jobs you want to get done out there. And luckily, with a community forest that was overgrown, you can go in and do some logging and make some money. And the way stewardship contracting works, whatever money is generated gets put in a special fund. It doesn't get sent back to DC and the Treasury like a lot of other timber projects do. And then that pot of money is then used to implement all the other projects that you've identified are important under this contract on this piece of land. I think one of the unique things about our community forest is a lot of stewardship projects are just sort of one-shot deals here and there. And this is a community forest, so we see the contract as a tool to implement our vision, whereas a lot of times a contract is just a project to get done and then move on. So it's worked really, really well. And if stewardship contracting legislation gets renewed this year, because it is expiring this year, then I know the BLM will go another 10 years with us. So that's encouraging. So this is one of the things we tried. We have a lot of blackberries, and there's a person who hired goats, or had goats for hire, and the fencing, and so we brought them out there along in a riparian area to eat the blackberries. And it worked really well. Unfortunately, the guy with the goats something happened to him, and that was the end of that one the following year. But you know, it's also in what's called in federal legislation adaptive management area, which is old option 9, President Clinton's forest plan thing from the 90s. And this is all AMA land, so you get to try stuff like this and see if it works or not, and document it, and then try something else. So we did. Here we are logging. Our first logging job was 2007, and we just did it again last year. Thinning. It's thinning, but we put some logs in the local mill, and for the first time in my life, I welcomed that sound on my front porch. I was like, they're cutting those trees. That is so cool. So, in fact, the guy that did the first job was out of French Gulch, and he was on the advisory committee for the BLM in the California Northern Region. I was an early proponent of the project, because we also went to them and did a presentation. And he ended up getting the job and cutting us a deal and doing a really nice job on the logging. Here's the firewood sale. These are people coming out with whatever they got. Excuse me, I have allergies and I get a dry throat. And they're picking up their wood. And the RC employees are out there to help and administer that. It's actually quite a logistical challenge to sell the cords and then stage the folks so that it's not crazy out there on one Saturday. But they got it down and it works. This is just sort of value added that happened. The pool, the local pool in Weaverville it's a nonprofit, and they're always trying to raise money to improve it and keep it going. And so one of them had the idea of getting boughs from the community forest to make wreaths to sell at Christmas to benefit the pool. So that got a little press, and some of the real estate agents are actually advertising the community forest as a benefit. Houses next to the community forest, backs up next to the community forest. So that's nice, very nice. Here's what we did in 2008. I thought, wow, this was so successful. Let's get the Forest Service on board. They have a lot of land in the basin. So we added 12,000 acres. And it's been a very different experience with the Forest Service. They have, a ranger district in Weaverville. They have a lot of ownership, if you will, of their lands. They're much more invested in what goes on there. They're not as hands-off as BLM. So it's been a different experience. It's been actually really difficult. However, we have it in a 10-year stewardship agreement, and it is an agreement. And our experience has been we should have had a contract. But at any rate, it's riddled with more trails. We've done one logging project up there, and it's got a lot of different pieces to it. There's oak woodlands, there's stuff that abuts the wilderness, there's more residential areas to consider, there's a campground, there's lots of trails. It's got a lot of different challenges, but I'm really, even though the Forest Service is difficult, I'm really glad we have it as part of the basin. People really connect to that as well. So yeah, it's 13,000 acres now. Here's our partners, lots and lots. I would have to say that the Trinity County Fire Safety Council was very instrumental in the beginning in helping us get this going, because they can certainly bring up the part about fire safe, fire resiliency, and all the goals and plans that they've done for the basin, so that really meshed nicely. But we have that bottom one in red because really, if it hadn't been for the people who went to the meetings and said, you know, this is a good idea, it wouldn't have happened. I'll never forget one of the first meetings we had when we went to this Natural Resources Advisory Committee that advised the Board of Supervisors, and this woman stood up and said, because we were talking about all the different pieces of the environment and habitat, she said, don't forget the people. People are part of the forest too. And I went home with my husband and I thought, oh, for Christ's sake, what, you know, and he said, no, she's right. If it isn't, if there aren't people here, this won't happen. And he was right and she was right. And so they have been the most important part. You know, we've had some additional community meetings, but most people are pretty satisfied with what's going on, and they don't, you know, I got a call a couple weeks ago from a woman, a friend of mine, who lives up in that subdivision in the middle of our BLM park, and her neighbor cut down a couple of trees, and he had chopped them up and stacked them on BLM land, and she was very concerned that this was a fire hazard, and he shouldn't have done that, not there, and I called up our district manager, and he was going out there with Walter Herzog from BLM anyway to talk about some other cleanup stuff after logging, and so he said, I'll talk to him about it, and I got an email from Walter, and he goes, this is what happened, that stuff's gonna get burned in the fall, it's too green now, I called Fauna, I told her, and I said, thanks guys, you put the community in community forest, that's what it's all about, you know, responding to individuals, gee, can we open that road to use it for an escape, you know, what about this tree over here? It's very personal, it's very much about relationships. This is an example of education, which I'm always trying to push because that seems to be the weakest part of what we do. Those kids in the top photo are an international group. The woman in the middle is from Ethiopia. Get them out there to measure trees and do a little preliminary, you know, basic forestry. And then this is like a summer camp group out in the creek, which West Weaver Creek goes through the middle of the BLM portion, and so there's lots of recreating opportunities. So we get them out there, look at bugs, count fish when they're there. Here's some of the projects that we identify each year to do. You can see some of the actual numbers of saw logs that we've been able to produce. Just a lot of other money that we're able to get because we can say, look, we've got this forest and we have this stewardship money, and hey, Fish and Game, hey, NRCS, hey, you know, whoever, water quality, you know, give us some money and we'll make it last, you know, we'll multiply it 6 times and get you even more money for your, or give more projects for your buck. So that happens quite a bit. A lot of trail stuff, which people love. This is just some of the work that's getting done out there. This is stuff we did last year. More trails. We're going to try and do a little burn eventually. Just a lot of road fixes because, you know, it's all about fish where we live. So a lot of upslope work. This was the horse logging. That was a couple of summers ago. Didn't really work out too well, but boy, was that a blast. I could hear that guy swear at his horses all the way where I lived. And he called them by name, and it was a kick. He was able, why we did this was, not only is this a community forest, within it, there is a designated mining district. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. The BLM archaeologists really wanted to get that registered because there's a lot of old mining stuff down there along the river. And so that is now a historic district. So we had to be pretty careful doing our thinning down there. So we tried horse logging to see if that was a way to do it without too much impact. And it was, except actually getting the logs out proved to be more difficult than we anticipated. But, you know, they make so many small little machines now to work in those kind of tight spaces that's becoming less of a problem. And there's the wood. I don't know what this picture is. People talking out in the forest, you know, that happens a lot. That's a good thing. also that there used to be a lot of trespass issues, and that road that does go through the BLM part was a mess and didn't get maintenance very often. But since it's become a community forest, BLM's put more resources into it, and there's more people out there. So there's less vandalism, there's less trashing, you know, people are vested in it, and it shows. This is this is my first PowerPoint, so I didn't really get a chance to learn how to edit this, but this is an employee of the RCD who got a very important award. She got a two chiefs partnership award. The two chiefs are the Forest Service and Interior and Ag, and she got an award for all the work she does on road rehabilitation. Some of which she's actually done at community forest. She's quite skilled at that. This is just some shots of people out in the forest doing stuff. One day we were out there with some other people, and these people showed up with horse trailers, and like, yeah, we're gonna go out and ride in the forest. So, oh, can we take your picture? There they are. And there it is. We are, reaching our, 8 years since we signed our first agreement. And kind of what's happened since then is the community forest has gained quite a national profile. In 2009, the BLM office in Reading submitted the Weaverville Community Forest as a candidate for Partners in Conservation, and we were one of the winners, if you will, across the nation. So we were flown back to DC, shook hands with Ken Salazar, and got an award. So our profile, it always surprises me because I live in a small town, that it's quite high, it's quite large, and it's a model that is often cited, and it's a really fine example of community activism and willing partners. And I truly believe that you need to have somebody within the organizations you're working for as an advocate for these things to succeed. And so we've been successful. And now we have some other things going on in the county. Some of you might have heard that last December, the Secretary of Agriculture, Vilsack, visited Weaverville and had a 2-day meeting with the leaders of the town. And out of it has come this Trinity collaborative where they're trying to deal with economic and forestry issues on federal lands. And the community forest was cited as an example of collaboration and success. But people moved on and different groups are forming and other things are happening. And I think we're at a kind of a juncture with community forest. And I'm not really sure what direction we're going to go next. Or what kind of projects we're going to do, or what's the fate of stewardship contracting, which is a vital component of our community forest. And so that's where we're at. And it's kind of cool and it's kind of weird. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or not.
So what happened with the land that they wanted to trade for?
I don't know if SPI ended up, I think BLM found some other land that they could trade. They did, actually. It was around Indian Creek. They had some big pieces up in the upper watershed of a creek called Indian Creek. And so I think they traded that to SPI, and they got their river land, and SPI got some nice timberland, which they kind of pulled in. So, yeah, again, BLM figured out another way to do it because they wanted to, and it worked. In Trinity County, it's federal land, federal land, federal land. We have 80% federal land. So it's never going to be a conversation about private timberland and getting conservation easements to protect, timberland. It's always going to be about working with the feds because that's what we have. So, it's a good and bad thing, like we all know. Yes?
So how is the Resource Conservation District funded?
Well, we, some RCDs actually derive taxes from their county, but we don't. So our money is all grant driven. So it's federal, state, sometimes we do fee for service. That's not a very good part of our budget. We do our contracts with the county are actually getting more substantial because that's what government's doing is contracting out for. But it's state and federal. And that's just around, for many years it was, we had a big pot of money from the feds through TPL, through Trust Public Land, to do a bunch of rehabilitation in a land BLM had acquired that had been just, it was in decomposed granite and it severely degraded from logging, and so that got put into BLM's stewardship, and RCD got the contract to actually do all the rehabilitation. That was a big pot of money for like 10 years. Then it was Forest Service, because when the timber receipts fell so drastically in the mid-90s, Congress came up with Secure Rural Schools Act, and that was sort of supplement money for a while to all these rural counties that the road department and the schools were losing money. So and then part of that was money for restoration, so RCD got a nice big chunk of that. Sometimes it's been a lot of state money, like farm and ranch land cleanup money, or off-road vehicle money, wherever we can get it. Department of Fish and Game, Water Quality Control Board, especially for road decommissioning and that kind of thing. Fire Safe for a long time, Fire Safe Council, that money dried up. Yeah. So we don't really have access to like Wildlife Conservation Board money or Forest Legacy money. That's all money for private land, and that's just not available to us.
So where does your revenue come from now to support this new contract you're applying?
The new what?
Where will your money come from to help support the RCD, and since you're applying for a renewal of your 10-year contract?
Oh, right. Because it's a federal partner, they always manage to find money to kind of help supplement the projects that have been identified to do. So so if Congress keeps just sort of delaying things, and I think things sort of get funded, and it's not quite a question, but the stewardship contract legislation is part of the Farm Bill. So should the Farm Bill actually pass this year, which I think is the only year it can pass for another 2 years, then we'll be good. They'll be good, and they'll find money to help us. It's like seed money to help us get started. And if we can cut more trees and do a little more thinning, then we can sweeten that pot as well. But we are in a place as an RCD where some traditional money is dried up, and we're really looking for other ways to get money. So one of the things we're actually exploring is to start a nonprofit, like Friends of the RCD, because that you can access money that way that you really can't as a sort of political subdivision of the state, which is what the RCD is now. So
Have you had any problems with mills closing so that you have less resources to sell your logs?
No, by the time this came along, we only had one mill. And thankfully, it's in the middle of Weaverville. And it even burned down, and they rebuilt it. Yeah, because I know that's a real problem elsewhere. Yes, it is. At one time, I think when my husband and I first moved to Trinity County, there were 4 mills in the county, and now there's one. So yeah, that's a real issue for any kind of forest stewardship. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to do this.
There you go. It's okay to run this computer, trust me.
Next we have Todd Sloat with the Fall River Resource Conservation District, RCD, talking about the Burney-Hat Creek Community Forest.
Excellent. Well, thanks for the invite. I appreciate it. It's always fun to talk about community forestry. I first heard this through the Trinity County RCD, so I think they have cast and set a real great example for lots of people to follow, and really appreciate your volunteer time as an RCD board member too. It's a great service, and there's lots of service organizations out there that you can be a part of, and if you're interested in what I call the whole enchilada of really treating from the top of the mountains to the bottom of wherever your water flows out of your watershed, community forest model, and these entities are good ones to choose. So this is the Burney-Hat Creek Community Forest and Watershed Group, not too far from here. And I put this slide, because it's probably the most important slide of presentation, because all the technical stuff that goes involved with fixing a stream or managing a forest or whatever, wildlife population analysis, really depends on the interactions that you have with people. And this is always reinforced with me in some of our meetings that we're having. It's just so important to get to know all the people in the collaborative group that you're interacting with at a personal level. And it really helps if you spend the time and take the time up front to get to know them. You may not agree with them, but if you get to know them, I think it's just really helpful. And I heard a social scientist at a presentation one time say, you know, these three phrases: what do you do, why do you do it, how long have you done it? It's just coaching, in a sense, a bunch of research biologists how to interact with people socially, but it was great. And so it's just a good reminder for me to think about. You know, I live in the Fall River Valley, grew up in a small farm. I'm not a horse fan. We have one of the biggest western cutting shows in the nation in MacArthur. I don't even go to it each year. It's one of the greatest fly fishing spots I can cloud hair and fly fish. I grew up there. I've never driven in our destruction river before. You know, I don't know if you've attended that, but it's a good, and I don't boat or anything. I mean, I've tried to, I say this because I'm trying to give you a little flavor for what I do. I do make it to Burney-MacArthur Falls once a year. But I'm mostly actually focused on meadow restoration. That's kind of what I do. I'm an independent contractor, biologist, hydrologist, and I'm very meadow-centric. And I spent a lot of time raising 3 kids, but they're finally out of the house now. And the empty nest, there's no extra time. I don't know. Somebody said there'd be lots of extra time spent with your wife, but that hasn't been true for me. This is what I mostly do. I sit in meetings. And it's really, oh yeah. And Sunday, my life changed because my wife brought home a puppy. She thought that I needed something extra to do. So I've been trying to learn how to figure out how to do office work and go to meetings with a puppy. So. But I'm going to skip this. I've got a bunch of slides in here, so I might just race through some that don't really apply. My vision of the community forestry model might be a little bit different. There's probably lots of variations of it. I think the way we apply ours is a little bit different than Colleen just talked about, so which will be kind of fun. But the way I think about it is you define an area, you assess resource issues and interests, you establish a collaborative group, identify projects, implement, and then use revenue, as she talked about, to implement other projects. The constraints of such a thing, a process, is there needs to be value. This whole concept of taking trees and using it for other projects that don't have value, there has to be value in the forest. And that always isn't the case in some areas. Reaching consensus, I mean, if your decision-making process is set up with consensus, collaboration is great when everybody agrees, but when there's not agreement, then you need another process. And then commitment from group members and staff, and basically it takes a lot of time. I think the time is well worth it. And so if you're interested in getting involved in community forest, there's a lot of upfront time. You can do some smaller projects at the start if you develop a community forest, but I like to think of it as a 5-year process. You know, from the time you start, before you time to really start implementing something pretty large scale, it's about a 5-year process. So there's lots of opportunities there. All lands management is a USDA term where they're really promoting the feds and thinking about all lands, not just federal land, but private land. So it is an opportunity to work with the feds. They're understanding that, you know, it's not their own silo. You can leverage resources with other people. You know, you have a greater number of people and interest to make better decisions, and it allows you also to solidify support for reviews and procedures such as compliance and permitting that you may have issues with. I don't know if is this the Shasta T mostly around this area?
Mostly.
Yeah. I don't know if the Shasta T faces lots of environmental challenges when the Forest Service puts up projects for sale. But you know, most Forest Service entities do. And but getting a broader commitment from stakeholders in the community is very helpful in trying to combat that. can only mention one thing as far as a professional facilitator. When we first started our project, the Shasta Resource Advisory Committee, which is a group of volunteers that meets in Reading about once every 2 months, contacted the Fall River RCD and said, we kind of have this vision, and their vision came from Trinity County RCD when they were presented with the community forest model. And they said, we'd like to try that somewhere else. So they called the Fall River RCD and said, would you guys got to be the guinea pig? And we thought, well, maybe, let's think about this some more. And we realized we were in over our head right away. So we contracted with an entity out of Taylorsville, social scientists with staff called Sierra Institute for Community Environment. We held a meeting with the Forest Service. We talked to them about this concept, and they were game. And so we started to talk about an area to define. And it first started off like a smaller area around Burney. And then it grew. And then all of a sudden we realized we were going to adopt the watershed concept. We took Burney Creek watershed. And then we thought, well, there's 50% private and public in Burney Creek. Let's go ahead and grab Hat Creek watershed too, because it has about 80% federal. And before we knew it, this thing was 360,000 acres in size, and we needed more stakeholders. And but it did have infrastructure there. There's 2 cogen facilities now instead of 3. Still 2 mills running. It's one of the highest severe wildfire areas in the state. This is really important. You won't find a bigger supporter of Forest Service than the Hat Creek Ranger District Committee.
What's a cogeneration plant?
So cogeneration is a term used for burning of wood products to generate multiple things, wood or heat, so cogen. People also refer to it as bioenergy. I've heard that term also. But I don't think it's a necessity to establish community forests or have a successful one. It can be challenging if you don't have a local Forest Service district that is funded and is active and is really easy to work with. And then willing stakeholders in the region. Our community forest was really instigated by private entities, and those are the first entities that we contacted locally, basically the 3 large timber owners and the ag contingency. So just a couple watershed slides. I don't know if that green shows up, but the green is supposed to represent federal land, Forest Service ground. Non-green is private ground. We don't really have any BLM ground to speak of. The interesting thing about this watershed that was selected, though, at the headwaters you have Last Volcanic National Park. And at the bottom end of the system you have McArthur-Burney Falls State Park. So you have a federal entity, National Park on the top, a state park at the bottom, and kind of a mix in between. Question?
Who selected this project?
Probably about 7 or 8 people in a room initially.
Uh-huh. And were they federal, government?
There was 1 federal person in there.
Uh-huh.
There was a social scientist. There was a Shasta Rock person. There was an ag person. There was myself.
And the spearheader of the project would be?
Well, initially it was the Shasta Resource Advisory Committee.
Uh-huh.
And then they basically pass it off to the RCD.
And
so
when was that? Sorry, when was that? Just trying to get a...
Oh, 2009. 2009. So basically the RCD Board of Directors kind of looked at me and said, do you have time to do this? I said, I'll try it. So, and then, start having community meetings, etc. Has anybody heard of the triple bottom line before? Show hands, you ever heard this term? Okay, you. So the triple bottom line, I hadn't heard of it before until 2009 when the social scientist said, well, what you're really looking for, we most often talk about improving the environment, improving the economy, but we really typically miss is factoring in the community there. And like most rural areas in the state, communities are really suffered in many ways, and in many complex ways that are hard to try to fix too. So that was a term that was new to me, and it's important to think about because when you're planning future project work, it's really important to think about the community in that because it's an integral part in your success or lack of it. So our first process was to kind of assess socioeconomic and resource conditions, We enlisted the Sierra Institute to do that. That was good. The RCD had been doing that type of thing for resource management plans, but it was good to kind of have somebody else do it that had different skills, that people maybe felt comfortable talking to, didn't have a stake in the game. They were outside of the region. So they did some stakeholder analysis and provided some findings and recommendations.
Was that a fee-for-service kind of thing?
This was straight from a grant. We hired it from a grant. Yeah.
What was the round number, what did it take to produce that?
It was a 2-year project, and I think it was around $80,000 to $90,000.
80 or 90?
And who were the stakeholders?
At this time, they called local businesses, agencies, and said, can you recommend people that we can interview? And so we recommended people, I recommended people, everybody recommended people. And from that list, they had a lot of similar people that were recommended, and some not similar. So I forget how many interviews they did, but when they would interview a person, they would also ask them, are there others that were missing? And then they kind of shared that list, and they actually have a term for it, social science, that it's called, I forget what it is, but that was the process for the stakeholder analysis.
These are stakeholders that will be impacted in the Hat Creek and Burney Creek drainage?
Correct.
How many private landowners are in that area?
In the area or the analysis?
Well, in your, what you described on the map, the region that you're.
Sierra Pacific would be the biggest, roughly.
Yeah, so the population in that watershed is about 5,000 people, roughly. Yeah.
So Burney, Casella.
Yeah. So mostly Burney, Hat Creek, and Castle are the 3 biggest communities. Fall River Mills is actually outside the watershed. This is something that was occurring at the time in 2010. It's fortunately subsided and gone the other direction a little bit. But it was good that the priority issues that the stakeholders identified were very consistent with what we had done in the past. So it at least validated the types of things we wanted to think about for issues within the region. And that is, high risk of fires, degraded riparian areas, meadows, water quality in particular is always a top one there. Unemployment at the time. It's funny to say struggling forest products industry in our region where we have 2 mills, but it's still struggling. Recreation and tourism, we don't do quite as much over here, but the Fall River and the Hat Creek are still really world destination spots for those activities. And for many of the local people, it's just trying to maintain a nice, high quality of life. So the stakeholders kind of suggested things that we should do, and they were consistent with some of the resource issues. Restore degraded areas, meadows, share information. This was one that they suggested, which is great, and I think it's great that this RCD takes a lead on this. It's really needed. We have some really lively meetings sometimes on some resource topics that people don't agree upon. Others are pretty benign, but it does provide a forum. And so the collaborative group establishment. Now this is an interesting concept because I don't think you have to establish a collaborative group. I suspect community forests could use them or use other existing groups. But we decided to establish one. We relied upon the social scientists and their team to recommend a group to the RCD. And so they tried to come up with a very diverse list of people and brought it to the RCD, and the RCD board of directors talked, and I said, well, you've talked to all these people, and they agreed. So all these people were at one point interviewed also in the process as part of the stakeholder analysis, and so they were kind of cued to say, if this thing starts off, would you be willing to commit for a couple of years? And I think some are excited that they did, and some aren't. That's just kind of the process that I discussed there. So, okay, I'm going to kind of transition into projects because when that list of people was kind of confirmed, they met in January of 2009, twice. And from 2 meetings, we asked them to identify projects, to try to think of good projects, short and long term, did some visioning. And we prepared grants for those projects. And these 3 kind of came to the list. They tried to pick a nice diversity. They picked a recreational project on Lower Hat Creek, which was not on federal ground. They picked a project on federal ground, which they called Whittington. And then they picked a project on private ground, on industrial timber landowners. And it's called Burney Gardens. And I'll kind of go through those projects now and describe them just briefly what they were. So the Hat Creek, the Lower Hat Creek, is anybody fish Lower Hat Creek by any chance? This was a world-renowned spot just upstream of 299 at one time. It was known as having some of the highest native trout populations per mile. And, but a slug of sediment showed up in, I forget, 90s. And the fishery went down. It was the first stretch of river in the state that was designated as wild and scenic. And it wasn't, people weren't happy with it. So we thought, it's owned by PG&E. We decided to try to assess and plan a project to try to improve that.
Can I ask where the sediment, was there a dam removed or something, and?
It's actually an amazing and complex story. It turns out it was from a volcanic tube.
Wow, nature.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, I say interesting because you would think it was Bond Lake immediately above it, a dam, you know. So, and, you know, it's, turning out it doesn't, it's good to know where it comes from because it allows you to try to solve it, you know, so, but it's in there now and we're trying to figure out how to solve it. So, you know, basically we get a paper document that says, this is what we suggest you do. And from that was in 2010, just identifying that project and spending about $20,000 to do this, resulted in this. And you guys have a cow trout office here in McLeod, and Cow Trout was able to team up with Department of Fish and Wildlife and other stakeholders and kind of picked up this ball and revived a group that had been going years. Well, it was kind of subsiding, their activity was low, but they picked it up and ran with it and secured a really big grant to implement the project. So it's just a good example of synergy. When you start a collaborative group and you start doing project work, some of the things that can happen in a positive way. We added new partners to our group. The Pitt River Tribe became really engaged because they were really excited about this area. It's a very important cultural area to them. The Whittington project was really selected. It's a you know, a very high risk fire area near the town of Burney on Forest Service land. It's was, you know, harvested in the 30s and replanted. It didn't grow well, had a lot of brush. It started, they tried it again in the 60s. This is back in the day where they took cats and ripped the soil and planted them in straight lines. And so, you know, it's a huge investment to try to restore and fix this forest structure there. It's about a $500,000 estimate actually to fix it. So, but you know, you can either fix it or let it burn. I can show some numbers later. It's generally better to fix it than let it burn. Burney Gardens Meadow is kind of the flagship project. This is a private meadow. It's owned by 4 private landowners. So PG&E, Sierra Pacific Industry, Fruit Grower Supply Company, and Red River Lumber Company, which is it's managed by WMA. And it's a really unique project. It's changed my whole vision of how to approach putting together big projects or small projects. It's a beautiful meadow in the spring. It's absolutely gorgeous. It has Thousand Lakes Wilderness, McGee Peak in the background there. It looks like a really healthy meadow, most of it does. But you see that location, it's the same location there, during the spring versus the fall. That's actually a head cut. And if I had a picture turned around facing the other way, it's basically an oversized street gem. And that head cut will eventually move up into that meadow slowly and, you know, lower the base elevation and kind of make it not a very pleasant meadow. Here's my one techie slide, because I'm meadow-centric. In really low gradient streams, really flat, you know, less than 1%, and if something it gets disturbed, it'll see that top one, it'll generally cut down at the base elevation. And then it generally hits something hard at some point, and then it goes wide. And then through time, trees and plants will grow back, but the result will be a lower elevation of that stream channel. And and that's called the channel evolution model. And that basic understanding of that will change how you think about a stream now when you see it in a low gradient system. You'll now see what we call entrenched stream channels everywhere, and they are.
When it gets channeled like that, does that dry the rest of the meadow out in the wet season?
Exactly. It acts as a drain.
Is that meadow formed from the 1914 eruption?
This one isn't actually.
So it's not light ash, it's
Right.
clay.
Yeah. And so, it's a generalization, but a lot of low gradient meadows are having problems. And it's typically not the sacred cow that did it, amazingly. It's often it's channelization, typically digging a straight channel. So, we see these probably in your region like we do ours. It's very common to see them right below bridges. But this is Bear Creek just over the pass there that flows into Fall River. Fall River's primary tributary was identified as a major sediment input to the Fall River system. But the rest of Burney Gardens Meadow, it's actually a really unique landform. It's about, 1,500 acres of absolutely flat terrain for the most part. At one time, we believed that it was a pretty good mix of open meadow and aspen habitat. There are some isolated aspens out there now, but it's really over-colonized by lodgepole pine. To the point where, if you've been in a lodgepole pine forest, it's really not that exciting. It's difficult to walk through. It's a high risk of fire hazard. It's just not a pleasant area. So I'm going to kind of go through the quick evolution of this project. So PG&E called the RCD and said, we have this 20-acre piece, that head cut that I showed you, that we'd like to fix. The RCD said, okay, we'll try to help you fix it. Then the collaborative group started, and then at the meeting, the PG&E was describing the issue, and the other foresters from the private timber company said, well, you probably should have wrote your THP like this. And then we said, well, what's the meadow like, or what's the forest structure like on your property? That's terrible. Well, would you like to fix it? Yes, we would. And it just kind of grew from there. And before we knew it, the size was about 2,500 acres. And we said, well, what do you really want out of it? You're obviously not managing this place because it doesn't have value. It's just grown lodgepole. It's not really good timber producing ground. And they, interestingly, the timber folks wanted to see the agency people talk to one another. That's what they wanted. And so it created a really interesting opportunity to use new policy to have the timber and the water quality divisions within the regional board and Fish and Wildlife to communicate. There's just two separate processes. I think this is probably going to be too techy here, so let me point to this real quick. I think this bullet item is worth noting though. We heard when we started talking about this project, we said, okay, we're going to treat this meadow. We're going to do one timber harvesting plan for it along all 4 landowners. And lots of people said, that's just a bad idea. That will not work. And it ended up working fine. The interesting thing is, anybody here have to do with CEQA? Yeah, a little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we basically, we just combined everything into the THP. And even for the open meadow structure, which is very unusual. We used some new Board of Forestry laws. We secured additional federal partners. It just turned out to be an amazing project. And I'm showing these slides because this is the part that really changed my thing about projects. And you mentioned, Colin, getting people in the field to talk about issues was unbelievable. We had the head of CAL FIRE in the field at one time, with water quality, fish and wildlife, and CAL FIRE staff that regulates timber harvesting plans. And everybody was feeling uncomfortable about certain aspects of the project because it was new to them. At one point where the CAL FIRE inspector said, you can't do that. We can't work in open meadows. And the senior staff said, sure we can. We just need an in-lieu practice, And it just kind of snowballed from there. And we submitted this, now we're actually doing channel work in forest structure, which isn't allowed in forest practice rules for the most part. And
Would
there's
you-
channel.
Would you say that I could see a big, huge problem being just trust between the groups, or lack thereof?
Yeah, I think trust is good. For us, it was almost, unfamiliarity with the way that certain policies are and the communication part. Like, for example, the timber division in water quality versus the water quality division, they operate by two different complete separate rules. And they apply those rules differently. And it drives people insane if you're working on both sides, if you work with both of them. So, they just don't go out in the field together. And then when the CAL FIRE person said, that's too much water quality impact for me, and the water quality person says, I'm fine with it. We like that. We think this is a good project. It's not short-term impacts, but a long-term gain. And so it really made it feel more comfortable because, so in part, it's, this CAL FIRE person feeling very uncomfortable with trying to manage something that's really out of his realm, but getting some faith and trust in the water quality person says, I've got your back. We'll monitor it for you.
Are you, while you're out there, are you doing anything like looking for endangered species, or is there any of that going on?
Yes. This is it's actually not the endangered tadpole shrimp, but it's called cryptic tadpole shrimp. It's a really unique species, kind of look like horseshoe crabs. So the endangered one occurs in the valley and vernal terrain. This actually occurs in a stream, which is really unusual. So the site is a pretty interesting site. So yeah, as far as the THP process though, it's really the same as CEQA. You have to assess special status species, TNE species, cultural resource surveys. It's the whole gamut of planning. So anyways, that Burning Gardens project led to working with the Forest Service more closely, and we helped submit with the Forest Service a grant proposal to the feds known as Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration. It was awarded. It's basically a 10-year grant for about $1 million a year that the Forest Service can use to treat their property. And there's, like I showed you, that Whittington project, it needs money. There are areas that have value and can use stewardship contract and treat other forest structure, but a lot of it's gone or tied up. So we really do need some grant funds for assistance to treat that forest. So, and I'll describe quickly how the Hat Creek was really leading the Forest Service in the Pacific, in the West, for getting projects not litigated. So, and I don't know who originated the idea, but they were the first to really run with it. They took the government land office data that was recorded in the 1800s when they set up the township range sections in the federal government. So, pound of the state, they went out and back in the 1800s, they wrote in the notes, so in the north, the largest tree, 20 feet, is Dougford, this big. They did that in 4 compass directions. Well, the Hat Creek went and compiled all that information for the whole district, analyzed it by elevation, aspect, and summarized it and said, this is what the forest structure used to look like, when the Native Americans were managing it. And so they took that data and they went to the people that were suing them and said, this is what it used to look like. This is what we're going to try to turn it back to. And if we follow this process and do good NEPA, would you concur? And they did. And they got a letter basically saying we would be sued.
Was that grazing land?
Some of it was. Yeah, there were allotments on the Forest Service
Is it
at
still
times.
grazing land?
There are some allotments still in the Forest Service.
Is this any part of the, there's a couple of big projects going on, California Foothills Legacy Area, 20 million acres being studied for potential to no human use. And there's the Sierra Foothills Migration Habitat Corridor Project, which is part of the California Migration Habitat Corridor Project. Any of this related to the point where we're now looking at species, their migration, and protecting that land. So these species can migrate freely without human interaction. Any of that involved in any of these projects?
We're outside of that area. Yeah, we're not looking at there. I mean, there is research going on in the region. I don't know all the details of it. I know there's, the fissure is being studied in this region. But I don't believe it's to that level that you're describing. So basically, I think that the take-home message is there's a 365,000 acre now that has a 10-year plan of action on federal ground. And the federal group is using the collaborative group as kind of a soundboard to how to manage it and plan it. some of the modeling that was done for this 10-year plan, $11 million investment, turns out it'll actually save $11 million in fire suppression costs if it's implemented, so that's a wash, back even. Has the potential to create 200 full-time equivalent jobs, so now we're on the plus side. And we had some of these numbers were supported by some treatments that were done in 2011, where the last national forest treated 4,500 acres. It produced a lot of product, and it made the forest healthier too. So, the chip piles at the cogen facilities were enormous in 2011, and they're still really, really big. So the question I heard for infrastructure earlier, we still have a huge infrastructure need. There's more supply than there is to treat it. And so that's what we're headed to next, is, on the bottom of that slide, we're trying to restart the Beaver Mill. We're trying to get a new bioenergy facility, cogen facility in Burney, because now we have stuff permitted to treat, jobs ready to be used, but nowhere to take it. It's pretty amazing. Just a couple last slides for thoughts here. I feel like we're doing this really good at the community level now. We're getting a lot better at interacting, collaborating, talking about all lands management, partnering. I don't see it as much at the higher levels. I don't see it as much at the state level or in Washington. So we actually have a little bit of a strategy to encourage that to happen. The Forest Service and the forest products industry still needs everybody's help. It's still viewed in a very negative context from past practices. I think it's rapidly changed. It's much better, but there's still opportunities for individuals to help in that process. And community forest is a great way to do that. Ultimately, we need to be able to find the beneficiaries of clean water, good lifestyle, and be able to pay for that treatment. Right now, it's grant money, it's taxes, etc. But the ideal world would be to have a system that paid for itself in that nature. One of the things I think is important in our area is that the talk has changed about the federal government Forest Service over there. It's a very positive talk, and it's nice. You can go into the coffee shop and people are complimenting the Forest Service, which is great. Hasn't always been that way. So with that, I went a little over time. I apologize for that.
I noticed actually with both of your examples, it sounded like the RAC is a county resource advisory committee. So if the RAC and the county at the county level are on board, it is a little different in Siskiyou County.
Is it? Oh yeah, sure. Siskiyou County opted out of the SNC.
In terms of that support for maybe not the idea of working forest, but actually how to engage in a collaborative way with community. It's at a different phase, which I see room for conversation and field trips to places where counties are
It's
working.
because we don't have the trust in the agencies in Siskiyou County.
So conversations, so
Yeah.
it's interesting,
That's
to see, I think just having conversations and where they start is different in different regions, and really helpful to see how things progressed. It looked like with projects that you all brought forward in different ways, there was already really that higher level of collaboration or willingness to collaborate and sit down in a room that was facilitated, rather than one person say yourself saying, here's what we're doing, what do you think? It was, let's get those resource advisory committee and those stakeholders together and come up with it. Was it the resource advisory committee that brought those folks together, those stakeholders together after the study was done?
No, they were just the initial impetus to call the RCD to say, we'd like somebody to take the lead on this.
And then they were hands-off, except for supporting.
Yeah, they supported. They said, if you prepare a good grant and give a meaningful process for a couple of years. Well, see, they had been funding lots of small projects for years. It felt like they just weren't getting a bang for the buck with small projects. So they wanted to try. They were a little bit desperate, really.
Right.
Yeah, they knew RAC funding was sunsetting, They wanted to really leave a mark, and it did. I mean, we now have adjacent beaver area that's considered with the Weaverville the community forest model. And the Forest Service there didn't have Quincy Library Group money, so their staff is way down.
Yeah.
You know, don't have any money to hardly do any planning, whereas the Hat Creek did. So, but you know, it was interesting because the RAC had a thought that there was lots of value out there on the Lassa that could be used to treat and pay for itself, and it turned out not to be the case. So, and so there was misconceptions even from within the RAC about how this was going to play out. I mean, I thought that was the case too. I'd done lots of wildlife surveys in the forest and saw large trees, and this will be great, but you never go out to the stuff that's really bad. You know, it needs a lot of money to treat. So, yeah. Any more questions?
You mentioned that you had more supply than you had a market to
Yeah.
bring it, and then I'm curious about the cost effectiveness of a cogen plant versus small diameter timber, and like which timber is most appropriate for each application.
Yeah. Well, that's just a question I think we're actually all struggling with. We have a granting for a feasibility study now, which covers all these potential ranges of using wood product. There's also new legislation out with SB 1122 that is really making it favorable for new bioenergy projects. It's a 50 meg carve out for wood bioenergy, and a price structure that is intended to be set so a new facility won't fail. And so I think it's a real good opportunity now. You know, is there one mill around this area? In the Weed Mouse Nest area?
Yeah, and it's a cogen.
Yeah, and you look at all this forest structure, it's not enough. You can't,
They only utilize really what they produce.
yeah,
so.
I mean, I suspect, so all the logs are exported south and north?
Yeah.
We had 3 mills at one time here.
Yeah. I mean, I heard one of the leading Forest Service ecologists give a presentation a couple months ago, and he basically showed a slide of California and talked about growth rate of trees and sunlight, oxygen, and clearly demonstrated that these forests are really growing fast. They're becoming more unhealthy. The rural communities are at much greater risk than they ever have been, especially with climate change. It's a little bit of a risky time. So, community forest is a great idea to try to help partners and stakeholders come together and resolve it.
Yeah, you threw out a figure that you could save $11 million worth of fire suppression costs.
Yeah.
I wonder how you come up with a figure like that.
Yeah, fortunately I didn't. But the way that grant program was structured, they had a modeler, and a model was built, and you inputted your data into the model. So basically you said, okay, we're going to treat X number of acres in these regions for a 2 to 5 year period, and the model projected that up to 10 years. And then within the model, CAL FIRE helped to build it, Forest Service helped to build the model. And so everybody was on the same plane field. When you entered your data, and I think we got a better bang for the buck because our forest was in such poor shape, for fire risk.
They seem like reasonable numbers anyway.
Yeah, I don't know.
$11
Yeah,
Sure.
I see numbers for fire suppression costs pretty high, but it was hard for me to wrap my head around that.
Seems like that would be a pretty good way to compare projects, but as an absolute figure, it might be questionable.
Yeah. So, but the modeling, I mean, it's really, when you think of all the connections, of all the benefits, and all the costs, from top of watershed to the bottom, and then with all the people and social structure, nobody's really come up with. That's really needed to factor in all that stuff.
Todd, do you end up leading the way for a lot of the grants to tie the community forest together? Is there a collaboration that actually gets together to say, all right, we're going to submit this grant, or here's this opportunity, we'll take the lead, can you support? Is that kind of an organic process, or is it pretty set?
It started off with the RCD. I mean, everybody was doing their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this does create a forum where it's more integrated. And so the Rivers and Parkways grant that Caltrans secured at the group meeting, they said, hey, there's this grant opportunity out there, well, probably go for it, nobody else has time to write it, please.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it's,
so people can easily plug in
yeah,
to the idea without having to really all move forward at the same time in the same way.
right.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, it is. I mean, and the other thing that's helping is the integrated regional water management plan. Because of that process, you're in a sense encouraged to collaborate on projects. And so you really get to learn about what other projects that people have in mind. So, you know, certainly there is some competition that still occurs on occasion. I mean, I had a guy call me last week and we're both looking at the same grant. We just, you know, did a handshake deal. I said, okay, I think your project's actually more important than mine, so good luck. Let me know if you need a support letter.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that happens still.
Is there anything you would have done differently in the first few years from what actually happened?
Yeah. Yeah, develop a charter. We,
Oh, really?
when we added partners and interests, we were operating on consensus. And then we didn't agree with diverse views. And so, and then you're left with trying to make a decision without a decision-making process.
Right.
And, you know, we hit a wall for 6 months. We just got UC Common Ground on board and under contract to be our facilitator. Before that, it was me and another person, and I'm a biologist trying to facilitate. I was a terrible facilitator when things were going bad. When things were going good, it's easy. You make a facilitator. When things are going bad, what's my strategy there? You're going to be a fist fight. You know, so it's a lot different. Yeah, that would be the one thing I would definitely change.
Could you program in a salary for yourself?
You know, I've had grant funds and then no grant funds in my coordination time for the project. So I'm glad that Common Ground is on board because I basically gave up grant funds to get them on board to do a better job because it was obvious that I wasn't going to be able to pull this off. So yeah, you can. The RCD does have some small revenue that comes into them, but that's really for an administrative assistant to kind of keep the lights on and do other things. Otherwise, their model is not to have any employees for the most part, and to have contractors like myself say, you know, we basically have an agreement. We know the range of the projects that they're interested in working on. I go out and spend my own time and money trying to secure grants or build projects for them, and then in turn, I'm implementing some part of the grant, and then they're recouping indirect costs and things to do other things that the RCD is interested in. So, some RCDs like Western States had a huge fee for service program, very successful for years. So, just depends, I think, on the local culture and nature. The board of directors have their view upon whether they want to see the RCD big or not. So, yes. So, is anybody in here interested in a community forest? I mean, it's great that folks are here on a Friday afternoon. That's really neat, and I appreciate you attending. And I mean, you really can help. Everybody needs help out there. The stronger you can make the partnerships and have an understanding of everybody else's interests, you can make some great things happen for the community. So hopefully this area Trinity County will spawn another one.
I would say that there would be interest if I could see threats to private property
Yeah.
in restoration projects.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of international study on some big projects happening globally, and including RED, which is being led by the United Nations to use large forest tracts as sinks, which ultimately is going to impact many landowners in the United States if this goes through. And unlike other countries, we actually value private property here. And so I see these projects as potential threat to farmers, ranchers, landowners, even people who have a small home with, you know, an acre, which is huge compared to the rest of the world. So that would be my concern. I know in the Sierra Nevadas, there's a lot of projects going on, and it's the small landowner that, through the checkerboard effect, is going to be taken over by, you know, if you find an endangered species here, and you've got somebody, you know, a private landowner right next to you, that impacts that private landowner. And I think there's something like 15 million species left to study at this point. So imagine 15 million species left to go. And California is one of the hottest biodiversity spots in the world. It's like, you know, landowners out, because we need to protect and restore and save and under cap and trade. I'm really concerned about how our forests are going to be used to offset the community and the community forest. Flying to New York, it's, I mean, CARB is just now getting involved and really getting into the details of cap and trade, which forests are at the center of because they're carbon sinks.
Right.
So I think it's great, and I love that the community benefits, but I'm also very concerned.
Have you been on that perk.org site before?
Per PERC?
PRC, yeah.
Yeah, out of Colorado.
Yeah.
I haven't yet. I've actually, somebody has said you need to go work for them.
Yeah.
But
For those of you who haven't heard, it's just that, it really talks about conservation in light of protecting private property rights. It's a nice, well, depending on your.
and there should be that win-win.
So,
There should be that
yeah.
win-win.
And I was just gonna add, generally, when we're talking about, or when this conversation is happening, it's willing landowners. That's really, I think,
Right.
what these two examples show, is that landowners wanting to address something that they recognize on a landscape scale, and it's not anybody telling them that they have to.
And it's interesting, sometimes that's from fear that things are going south and could get worse, and other times it's just out of pure, interest. So it's a nice diversity of, I mean, this community forest is led by, in a sense, staff of 3 timber companies, because they, and the perspectives are different within those timber companies too, and how they interact with the community forest group.
So culturally, are they different, just
Yeah.
where they're based out of, just the whole?
Yeah, just the culture of the company itself. So, which is fine. I mean, I think the Forest Service is fearful of us telling them what to do, and the private property rights the same thing. So,
I think the other interesting thing is, I think I saw fruit growers, I saw PG&E, I saw Sierra Pacific,
yeah.
and one other. And that, when you talk about landowners, they are huge landowners. Huge. So that kind of landowner is very different from a
Sure.
farmer
Yeah.
landowner. And I think that when people think about landowners, I think about small landowners, but when you look at these projects, these are landowners that own hundreds of thousands, if not millions of acres. So for them to, give up some control of their land as a landowner is different from a farmer, or a rancher, or a homeowner who, loses everything that they've got when you've got this endangered species now that's encroached on their private property. And so there's got to be a win-win. I don't see the win-win yet at this point. I see small landowners being plowed over.
How are they giving up control?
Well, so if you're a small landowner alongside this meadow and they found an endangered yellow-legged frog, which then migrates over across the fence, now we got to protect where that frog goes on somebody's private property.
I don't even think it has to cross the fence.
Yeah, it doesn't, it
This
just
has
has
the
to be in the
potential.
area. So I think that's where we're heading right now, is loss of private land.
Just like limiting the development of that land?
It doesn't matter.
Or
If you
use.
graze, you
Oh,
can no
okay.
longer graze. If you, mow your lawn, you can no longer mow your lawn. If you want to cut down a tree, now you have to do a 15,000 to 50,000 timber harvest plan and hoot, for the spotted owl. I mean,
It's
it's
only if
just,
it's commercial. So-
no, it's not.
Yes, it is.
What a frog fence.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's certainly very complex. I mean, it depends on species, so to some degree it is. And that's the take home too, is all this stuff's really complex.
Mhm.
And whether it's big private industry or big government, we're not really good at having simple mechanisms in there that can resolve some of these issues. So it really does need a very good broad community-based approach to it.
I agree.
And it helps just to see that public-private conversation.
Yeah, it's very important. They have to interact.
Yeah.
Okay.
And at this point, it kind of sounds like you're just working on those large landowners, whether it be public or industrial. Have you done work that's near smaller landowners, or is that relatively far away from that?
One of the projects that I did, we selected those first three just because they were bigger. Our smaller projects were smaller private landowners, more kind of like fire safety protection. We started out a fire safety council in the Burney area, and now just starting to work with small private landowners for fire protection. We have a pretty big ag contingency there, and it's a mix of small to large folks there. Most of the ag stuff, typically, we work with them doing meadow type of work and stream improvements and water quality work, so it's a good kind of mix. We utilize NRCS, obviously, some of the other partners there.
And I guess to just ask Colleen too, since you live right next to the community forest as a small landowner, have you seen much of an impact to your neighbors? Has there been any sort of, I guess, osmosis between the public and private lands at all, or has it been relatively isolated between the two?
There's been some, but like when we were doing our latest logging project, some people who had moved into the neighborhood since it all started didn't know what was going on, and they were concerned about the noise and the trees coming down, and so we had a little meeting and went out there with some agency people and told them what was going on and showed them and asked them for input, and when they understood the project and then got a little bit of the history of the forest, then they were fine with it. So generally speaking, there's kind of a community consensus about the community forest in the whole basin, so there's a lot of tolerance because there's acceptance.
And you guys have done a great job. If you were to walk into Burney and say, how's your community forest, you might find 1 out of 10 that even know exists.
Yeah, get some t-shirts made.
It's a good idea. Our paper usually only likes to publish the really negative stuff.
Yeah.
We need to create some controversy, I guess. Well, thanks, great questions.
Thank you, great presentation.
So yeah, thank you, Todd and Colleen, for driving out here. It's kind of interesting because in Siskiyou County, we live sort of in the middle of 3 great projects, actually. We have Ashland in the north, the Ashland Forest Restoration project as well, which is a community forest style project. But within Siskiyou County, we haven't really started anything. And that's a conversation maybe that we should have and address sort of these issues. And is it a win-win situation? Is it something that we can do on public lands in our area? I just wanted to give a shout out for next month. We actually will be having the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project come down, as well as a local industrial forestry consultant speaking about the differences between sustainable forestry and restoration forestry, and how that affects forest health, and how it achieves different goals in forest management. So we don't have a date pinpointed it right now. It will be towards the end of June, so keep an eye out for posters and newspaper article that we put out, or join our email list, which we give out an announcement once a month when we have those workshops. So thanks for coming out. Thanks for bringing your very interesting questions, and I hope to see you around again.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, what's the time?
Yes.